Welcome to the Podkey summary of Walls of Constantinople. Constantinople's defenses were never just one famous wall. They were a whole evolving system of land walls, sea walls, gates, moats, towers, slopes, and constant repair work that helped protect the city for more than 1,000 years. What makes the story especially interesting is that the walls were brilliant engineering, but they were also only as strong as the people maintaining and manning them. And even after the empire was gone, the fight over how to preserve those walls kept going in a different form. One of the easiest mistakes to make is picturing Constantinople as a city with a single massive barrier around it. It really grew through layers. The defenses started with the smaller fortifications of Greek Byzantium, then expanded through the Severan and Constantinian periods, and eventually reached their most famous form in the Theodosian land walls. Later, the Blacherne area added its own defensive adaptations, which mattered because the terrain there was different, and the city kept having to respond to new pressures. That's part of why these fortifications lasted as long as they did. They weren't a frozen masterpiece built once and left alone. They kept being repaired, rebuilt, and adjusted after earthquakes, floods, political turmoil, and changing military technology. The landward defenses are the real headline here. The Theodosian walls ran about 5.7 kilometers across the side of the city most vulnerable to attack, and they were designed as a full defensive depth, not a single line. You had an inner wall around 12 meters high, a lower outer wall, terraces between elements, posterns, lots of towers, and then a moat more than 20 meters wide and up to 10 meters deep. That arrangement forced attackers to solve one problem after another. Even if they reached one barrier, they were still exposed to defenders on the next line. And the details were smart too. The towers supported each other, and their spacing changed with the terrain, instead of following some neat but inflexible pattern on paper. The construction itself helps explain why these walls were so resilient. They used carefully cut limestone, bands of brick, and a mortar and rubble core. Those brick courses weren't there just to look nice. They helped tie the structure together and improved how it handled earthquakes, which is a pretty important feature in that part of the world. Even the moat was more sophisticated than it sounds. It may not always have been permanently flooded, but the transverse walls and water pipes suggest it could be divided into sections and used both as an obstacle and as part of water management. So this wasn't just brute mass. It was a very practical, adaptable piece of defensive engineering. For more than a millennium, these fortifications helped shield the Roman and Byzantine capital from Avar Sasanian forces, Arab armies, Rus, Bulgars, and plenty of other enemies. Medieval writers and modern historians alike have treated them as some of the most successful city walls ever built, and it's hard to argue with the record. What's striking is that they stayed formidable, even after gunpowder entered the picture. During the Ottoman siege of 1422, cannon fire still failed to break them. And in 1453, the city held out for nearly 7 weeks. The fall of Constantinople wasn't simply the moment artillery erased the whole system in one clean technological victory. The outcome also reflected manpower shortages, internal weak points, and breakthroughs at vulnerable spots. In other words, the wall still mattered enormously right to the end. This is one of the biggest themes running through the whole story. Fortifications don't defend themselves. Back in 447, after serious damage, the city reportedly mobilized 16,000 workers, including the chariot racing factions, to get emergency repairs done. That image alone is wonderful. Sports rivalries, but make it infrastructure. By the late sieges of 1422 and 1453, the problem was almost the opposite. The defenders were too few to hold both the inner and outer circuits effectively. So the wall's success always depended on labor, organization, and enough people being in the right place at the right time. Not every part of the fortifications was only about stopping attackers. The Golden Gate also carried enormous ceremonial weight. It was a military strong point, but it was also the capital's grand entrance for imperial triumphs, coronations, and even rare papal visits. Its monumental marble arch was meant to connect Constantinople to the triumphal image of Rome. It told visitors that this was not some provincial outpost. This was an imperial capital with a very deliberate sense of continuity. Over time, as Byzantine fortunes declined, the gate was reduced and sealed up. Under the Ottomans, it became part of the fortress of the Seven Towers, and the complex took on very different lives as a citadel, treasury, archive, and prison. And then there's the legend that the last emperor, Constantine XI, was turned to marble and waits beneath the sealed gate until the day he returns to reclaim the city. History leaves room for myth when a place carries that much emotional weight. The sea walls were lower and simpler than the land walls. But that doesn't mean they were unimportant. They wrapped the shores along the Golden Horn and the Marmara, and worked together with the city's natural setting. Strong currents helped protect the Marmara side, and a heavy chain could be stretched across the Golden Horn to block hostile ships from entering directly. That said, the maritime defenses had limits. The Fourth Crusade exposed that brutally in 1204, when Venetian forces managed to storm the sea walls. After the Byzantines recovered the city in 1261, Michael VIII Palaiologos reinforced and heightened those defenses, and later emperors kept adding screens, secondary walls, moats, and more repairs. The geography was never just background scenery, it was part of the defensive system itself, right down to currents, harbors, and steep slopes that reduced the need for a moat in some Blacherne sections. The walls didn't simply vanish after the Byzantine period. They were largely maintained under the Ottomans, which is part of why so much survived at all. But in the 19th century, as Istanbul expanded beyond its medieval footprint, sections started to be dismantled. Railway construction and later coastal roads damaged or destroyed major stretches of the seawalls. From the 1980s onward, restoration picked up, with help from UNESCO, but that opened a whole new argument over what preservation should actually mean. Critics say some projects used inappropriate materials, cared too much about surface appearance, and wiped away archaeological evidence in the process. The 1999 earthquakes made that criticism hard to ignore, because some restored sections collapsed while the original masonry underneath stayed standing. By 2008, the World Monuments Fund had placed the walls on its list of the world's 100 most endangered sites, which is a reminder that preserving a monument can be almost as complicated as building one in the first place. What stays with me is how much these walls were a living system. Stone, brick, water, terrain, labor, ceremony, myth, and constant maintenance were all part of the same story. And maybe that's why they still feel so vivid now. They weren't just built to impress people, they were built to keep working. And in many ways, they still are. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.